It looked like an innocent school photo, but the child's hand tells another story. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of the Massachusetts Historical Society archives, casting long shadows across Dr. Sarah Mitchell's desk. She had been cataloging photographs for 3 weeks now, part of a digitization project documenting early American education. Most images were predictable: stiff children in their Sunday best, stern teachers, wooden schoolhouses against bare landscapes. Then she found it. The photograph was dated March 1902, labeled simply, Lowell Elementary School, Grade 3. 23 children stood in 3 neat rows outside a brick building, their faces solemn as was customary for the era. The teacher, Miss Eleanor Preston, according to the faded ink on the back, stood to the left, her expression as rigid as her high-collared dress. Sarah almost moved on to the next image when something caught her eye. She leaned closer, squinting at the photograph. In the front row, a boy of perhaps 9 or 10 years old stared directly at the camera. His clothes were cleaner than most, his hair neatly combed, but his hands— Sarah reached for the magnifying glass she kept on her desk. Her breath caught. The boy's left hand rested on his knee, palm facing the camera at an unusual angle. Even in the grainy photograph, she could see them. Deep, dark lines crossing his small palm. Not the natural creases of a child's hand, but something else entirely. Scars. Burns, perhaps. And his fingers. They seemed bent at odd angles, as if they had been broken and healed incorrectly. Sarah had spent 5 years researching labor history before shifting to educational archives. She recognized those marks. Mill workers bore them. Factory hands carried them. But this was a school photograph. A child. She flipped the photograph over again, searching for more information. Only the school name, the date, and the teacher's name. No student roster. No names attached to those young faces. Sarah set down her magnifying glass and reached for her laptop. Something about this photograph demanded attention. That boy's hand was telling a story that his carefully composed expression could not. She needed to know what had happened to him, and why someone had made sure he was in that photograph at all. Sarah spent the evening researching Lowell, Massachusetts in 1902. The city had been built on textile manufacturing, its economy dependent on the massive brick mills that lined the Merrimack River. By the turn of the century, Lowell was one of America's industrial powerhouses, producing cotton cloth that clothed half the nation. But the machinery that produced such wealth required hands to operate it. Small hands that could reach into tight spaces, quick fingers that could tie broken threads. Children as young as 6 worked 12-hour shifts in the mills, their wages essential to immigrant families struggling to survive. Sarah found newspaper articles from the era. The Lowell Courier reported mill accidents with disturbing regularity. A girl's hair caught in machinery, a boy's arm crushed by a loom, fingers severed by spinning frames. The articles were brief, matter-of-fact. Industrial accidents were simply part of life. She discovered that Massachusetts had passed its first child labor law in 1866, prohibiting children under 10 from working in manufacturing. But enforcement was minimal, and mill owners routinely falsified birth certificates. By 1902, reformers estimated that nearly 20,000 children worked in Massachusetts factories, many of them in Lowell's textile mills. Sarah pulled up maps of Lowell from 1902. The Lowell Elementary School sat just 3 blocks from the largest mill complex in the city, the Butte Cotton Mills. The proximity wasn't coincidental. Mill owners often built schools nearby, partly from civic duty, partly to maintain appearances of respectability. She found photographs of the mills, massive 6-story buildings with hundreds of windows, smokestacks belching dark smoke into gray skies. Inside those buildings, the noise was deafening. The constant clatter of looms, the whir of spinning frames, the shouts of overseers. And somewhere in those mills, before or after that school photograph was taken, a boy had injured his hand so severely that the scars were visible even in a century-old photograph. Sarah printed the school photograph and pinned it to the corkboard above her desk. Tomorrow she would visit Lowell herself. The city archives might have school records, attendance logs, anything that could identify the children in that photograph. That boy's hand was trying to tell her something. She intended to listen. The Lowell Historical Society occupied a converted mill building on Market Street, its brick walls a reminder of the city's industrial past. Sarah arrived early on a Tuesday morning, the photograph carefully protected in an archival folder. The archivist, an elderly man named Thomas Chen, greeted her with interest. 1902 school records. He adjusted his glasses, studying the photograph she'd laid on the counter. We have some, but they're incomplete. Many schools didn't keep detailed rosters back then. He disappeared into the back room and returned 20 minutes later with 3 leather-bound ledgers, their pages yellowed and brittle. These are from Lowell Elementary. Attendance records mostly. Some teacher notes. Sarah settled at a research table and carefully opened the first ledger. The handwriting was elegant but faded, each entry recording a child's name, age, and days present. She found March 1902 and ran her finger down the list for grade 3. 24 names. One more than appeared in the photograph. Someone must have been absent that day. She copied each name into her notebook. James Sullivan, Mary O'Brien, Giuseppe Rossi, Anna Kowalski. The names reflected Lowell's immigrant population, Irish, Italian, Polish families drawn to the mills by the promise of work. One name stood out, Thomas Murphy, age 9, marked present on the day the photograph was taken. Next to his name, in different ink, someone had written a single word, absent, mill. Sarah's pulse quickened. She turned the page, looking for more entries about Thomas Murphy. The pattern was clear. Present for a few days, then absent for weeks at a time, always with the same notation. Absent, mill. The teacher had been tracking where he was. In the margins of one page, she found a longer note in the same elegant handwriting. T. Murphy's hands worsening. Spoke with family. No change possible. He insists on attending when able. Sarah sat back, her heart heavy. The teacher had known. She had documented it, noted it, but what could she do? In 1902, a teacher had no authority over a family's economic decisions. Sarah spent the afternoon searching for information about Eleanor Preston, the teacher in the photograph. The Historical Society had a biographical file on prominent Lowell residents, and to her surprise, Miss Preston had one. Eleanor Preston had been born in 1875 in Boston, the daughter of a university professor. She'd attended the Boston Normal School, a teacher training institution, and arrived in Lowell in 1899 at age 24. Unmarried, which was common for teachers of that era, she had dedicated herself entirely to her students. But what struck Sarah most was a newspaper clipping from 1903, carefully preserved in the file. The headline read, "Local teacher testifies before state legislature on child labor conditions." Sarah's hands trembled as she read the article. Eleanor Preston had traveled to Boston and testified before a legislative committee investigating child labor practices. She had brought documentation, attendance records showing children missing school to work in mills, descriptions of injuries she'd witnessed, testimony about families trapped in poverty. The article quoted her directly. "I have watched children arrive at school with hands bandaged, faces scarred, spirits broken. They fall asleep at their desks, exhausted from nighttime shifts. One boy in my class worked from midnight until dawn at the boot mills, attended school until 3, then returned to the mills until midnight again. He was 9 years old. The article didn't name the boy, but Sarah knew. Thomas Murphy. It had to be. She found more clippings. Eleanor Preston had become a controversial figure in Lowell. Mill owners called her a troublemaker, accused her of exaggerating conditions. Some parents, desperate for their children's wages, resented her interference. But other teachers supported her, and reform organizations in Boston championed her testimony. Then, in 1904, the records abruptly ended. Eleanor Preston had left Lowell. No forwarding address, no explanation in the school records. Sarah leaned back, studying the photograph again. Eleanor Preston stood at the edge of the frame, her expression unreadable. But now Sarah understood. This wasn't just a school photograph. It was evidence. Eleanor Preston had documented these children deliberately, knowing what some of them endured. Sarah's next step required old-fashioned detective work. She needed to find Thomas Murphy's family, or at least trace what had happened to them. The 1900 census records were available online, and she started there. She found them quickly. Patrick Murphy, age 38, born in Ireland. Occupation, mill worker. His wife Catherine, age 35, also born in Ireland. 4 children listed: Margaret, 12, Thomas, 7 in 1900, which meant he'd be 9 in 1902, Bridget, 5, and baby Patrick, 1. The family lived on Appleton Street in a tenement district near the mills. Sarah cross-referenced with city directories and found that dozens of families crowded into the buildings there, most of them Irish immigrants working in the textile industry. She searched for records of what happened to the family after 1902. The 1910 census showed Patrick Murphy, now a widower. Catherine had died. Sarah found a death certificate dated 1905. Cause: consumption, the old term for tuberculosis, common in the crowded, poorly ventilated tenements. Of the children, only Margaret and Bridget appeared in the 1910 census, both listed as mill workers. Thomas wasn't listed at all. Sarah felt a chill. Children who disappeared from census records in that era usually meant one of two things: they'd died or they'd moved away. Given Thomas's injuries and the dangerous conditions in the mills, she feared the worst. She spent hours searching death records for Lowell between 1902 and 1910. The lists were heartbreaking. Children dead from mill accidents, from disease, from malnutrition. But she found no Thomas Murphy. Finally, in a box of uncatalogued documents at the Historical Society, she found something else. A ledger from the boot mills, listing child workers employed between 1900 and 1906. The records were incomplete, but there, on a page dated 1901, she found him. Thomas Murphy, age 8, employed as a doffer, a child who removed full bobbins of thread from spinning frames and replaced them with empty ones. The job required quick hands and constant movement. It also meant working among machinery that could easily catch clothing, hair, or small fingers. In the margins, someone had noted, injured March 1902, returned to work April 1902. Sarah discovered that Eleanor Preston hadn't worked alone. Her testimony in 1903 had been part of a broader movement, and Sarah found the names of other reformers who had fought against child labor in Massachusetts. One name appeared repeatedly: Florence Kelley, a national figure in the child labor reform movement. Kelley had visited Lowell in 1902, documenting conditions in the mills and photographing child workers. Her reports had shocked the nation. Sarah found letters in the Massachusetts State Archives, correspondence between Eleanor Preston and Florence Kelley. The letters were careful, coded in places, clearly written with the knowledge that mill owners might intercept them. One letter, dated February 1902, caught Sarah's attention. "I'm arranging for a photograph of my students to be taken in March. I believe visual documentation may prove valuable to our cause. Several children bear visible marks of their employment. If we can preserve evidence of what we witness daily, perhaps those in power cannot continue to deny what exists in plain sight." Sarah's breath caught. The school photograph hadn't been routine at all. Eleanor Preston had orchestrated it deliberately, knowing that some of her students carried evidence of child labor on their bodies. Thomas Murphy's scarred hand wasn't an accident captured on film. It was proof, deliberately documented. She found more letters, these from after the photograph was taken. Eleanor Preston had sent copies of the school picture to Florence Kelley, to state legislators, to reform organizations in Boston and New York. She'd included detailed accounts of which children in the photograph worked in the mills, their injuries, their missed school days. The response had been fierce. Mill owners had pressured the school board to dismiss Eleanor Preston. Parents who depended on their children's wages had called her a threat to their survival. Even some community leaders had turned against her, arguing that she was exaggerating conditions and harming Lowell's reputation. But she'd also gained allies. Other teachers had come forward with their own documentation. Doctors had testified about treating child mill workers for injuries and exhaustion. Clergy members had spoken about families trapped in impossible situations. The photograph, Sarah realized, had been a catalyst. One image that captured what words alone could not: the reality of child labor, visible in a boy's scarred hand. Sarah obtained transcripts of the 1903 legislative hearings from the State House Archives in Boston. Reading Eleanor Preston's testimony was like hearing her voice across a century. "I teach 24 children in grade 3, Eleanor had told the committee. Of those 24, 16 work in the mills either before school, after school, or during the night shift. They arrive exhausted. They struggle to hold pencils because their hands are injured. They fall asleep at their desks. This is not education. This is a pretense we maintain while children suffer." A legislator had questioned her. "Are you suggesting that parents are harming their children by allowing them to work?" Eleanor's response was direct. "I am suggesting that we have created an economic system that forces families to choose between their children's education and their survival. No parent should face such a choice. No child should pay such a price." She had then described specific cases, and Sarah recognized the details. One boy, 9 years old, works as a doffer at the boot mills. In March of this year, his hand was caught in a spinning frame. 3 fingers were broken. His palm was burned by the hot machinery. He missed 5 days of school. When he returned, his hand was barely healed, but his family could not afford for him to miss more work. He is back in the mills now. Eleanor had brought the photograph to the hearing. Sarah found a reference to it in the transcript. I have here a photograph of my students, taken in March 1902. I asked the committee to examine it closely. Look at their faces. Look at their hands. This is the evidence of what we permit to happen in our Commonwealth. The transcript noted that the photograph had been passed among the committee members. Some were moved. Others were skeptical. Mill owners' representatives who testified afterward called it manipulative, argued that isolated incidents were being presented as typical conditions. But the testimony, combined with similar accounts from other witnesses, had an effect. In 1904, Massachusetts passed stricter child labor laws. The minimum age for factory work was raised to 14. School attendance was made mandatory until age 14, and enforcement mechanisms were strengthened. It wasn't enough. Children still worked in mills for years afterward, but it was progress. And it had started in part with one teacher's determination to document the truth. Sarah couldn't let go of the question, what had happened to Thomas Murphy? He'd vanished from records after 1902, but someone his age would only be in their early 30s by 1920, still young enough to appear in census records if he'd survived. She expanded her search nationwide. The 1920 census was fully digitized, and she searched for Thomas Murphy, born around 1893 in Massachusetts. Hundreds of results appeared. It was a common Irish name, but she filtered by age and birthplace, looking for patterns. Then she found something. Thomas Murphy, age 27, living in Chicago, Illinois. Occupation, factory inspector. Sarah's heart raced. A factory inspector. She searched for more information and found records from the Illinois Department of Labor. Thomas Murphy had been hired in 1918 as part of a new program to enforce workplace safety regulations and child labor laws. She found newspaper articles about his work. In 1921, he'd testified in a case against a Chicago meatpacking plant that employed children. In 1923, he'd helped shut down a textile mill where conditions were dangerous. The articles mentioned that Murphy had personal experience with industrial injuries from his childhood. It was him. It had to be. Sarah found one more crucial document, an oral history interview conducted in 1945 as part of a labor history project. Thomas Murphy, then in his 50s, had been asked about his experiences as a child worker in Lowell, Massachusetts. His words, transcribed decades ago, came alive on the page. I started working in the boot mills when I was 8 years old. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. My father had been injured and couldn't work full-time, so my wages kept the family fed. I remember being so tired I could barely stand, but if you stopped, you got docked pay, or worse, fired. He described the accident. The spinning frames moved fast and you had to be quick changing the bobbins. One day I wasn't quick enough. My hand got caught. I felt the bones break, felt the heat of the machinery burning my palm. The overseer pulled me free, wrapped my hand in a rag, and told me to go home. No doctor, no compensation, just go home. Then he mentioned Eleanor Preston. My teacher, Miss Preston, she was different. She noticed things. In the oral history transcript, Thomas Murphy continued his account, and Sarah read with growing emotion. Miss Preston noticed my hand when I came back to school, Thomas had said in the interview. Most adults pretended not to see. It was easier that way. But she asked me directly what happened. I told her. I was 9, and I didn't know yet that I was supposed to lie about such things. He described how Eleanor Preston had documented his absences, how she'd spoken with his family. My father was ashamed, Thomas recalled. He knew it was wrong, sending a child into those mills, but what choice did we have? My mother was sick. We had younger children. Without my wages, we would have starved or ended up in the poorhouse. Then Thomas mentioned something that made Sarah immediately search the archives again. Miss Preston wrote me a letter. I kept it my whole life. She gave it to me just before she left Lowell. Said I should remember that I deserved better, that what happened to me wasn't right, and that someday I might be able to help other children. Sarah spent the next 2 days tracking down Thomas Murphy's personal papers. He had died in 1968 in Chicago, and his documents had been donated to the Chicago History Museum by his daughter. She called the museum, explained her research, and asked if they had any correspondence from Eleanor Preston. The archivist checked the collection and confirmed, yes, there was a letter dated December 1904. Sarah took the first available train to Chicago. The letter was preserved in acid-free paper, the ink faded but still legible. Eleanor Preston's handwriting was the same elegant script Sarah had seen in the school records. "Dear Thomas," it began, "as I prepare to leave Lowell, I want you to know that you have been one of the bravest students I have ever taught. You endured what no child should endure, yet you never lost your kindness or your desire to learn." The letter continued, "I failed to change the system that harmed you. I tried, but I was only one teacher, and the forces arrayed against reform are powerful. But I want you to remember something. The photograph we took last March, the one that shows your injured hand, that photograph has traveled to Boston, to New York, to Chicago. People have seen it. Legislators have studied it. It became evidence in a way that words alone could not." Eleanor wrote about the new child labor laws passed that year, acknowledging they weren't enough but hoping they would help future children. Then came the passage that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "Your hand tells a story, Thomas, not just of your suffering but of your survival, of your strength, of every child who works in conditions that destroy their bodies and steal their childhoods. I hope that someday you might tell that story yourself, that you might help others understand what must change." The letter ended simply, "You are worthy of a better world. Don't forget that. Your teacher, Eleanor Preston." Sarah stood in the Chicago History Museum, holding photocopies of the letter and the original school photograph. Thomas Murphy had indeed spent his life fighting for other children, becoming one of Illinois' most effective factory inspectors in the 1920s and 1930s. His daughter, Margaret Murphy, named after Thomas's eldest sister, had included a note with her father's papers when she donated them. "My father rarely spoke about his childhood, but when he did, he always mentioned two things: his scarred hand, which he said reminded him every day why his work mattered, and his teacher, Miss Preston, who told him that his suffering could have meaning if he chose to give it meaning." Sarah researched Eleanor Preston's life after Lowell. She had moved to New York City in 1905, working with the National Child Labor Committee, helping to document child labor conditions across the country. She had traveled to textile mills in the South, canneries in California, coal mines in Pennsylvania, always with her camera, always documenting. Eleanor had never married, dedicating her life to reform work. She had died in 1947 at age 72, recognized by labor organizations as a pioneer in child welfare advocacy. Sarah thought about the photograph that had started her investigation. What had seemed like a simple school portrait from 1902 had been an act of deliberate documentation, a teacher's attempt to create evidence that could not be ignored. Thomas Murphy's scarred hand, visible in that century-old image, had indeed told a story. Not just his story, but the story of thousands of children who worked in America's mills and factories. Eleanor Preston had made sure that story was preserved, that it could speak across generations. Sarah returned to Boston and prepared her findings for publication. But first, she created a digital exhibition for the Historical Society's website. The centerpiece was the 1902 school photograph, with Thomas Murphy's hand clearly visible. The caption she wrote read, "This photograph, taken by teacher Eleanor Preston in March 1902, became evidence in Massachusetts's 1903 child labor hearings." The boy in the front row, Thomas Murphy, bore scars from working as a doffer in the boot cotton mills. His injuries, documented in this image, helped legislators understand the reality of child labor. Murphy survived to become a factory inspector in Chicago, dedicating his life to protecting children from the conditions he had endured. His teacher's act of documentation gave voice to the voiceless and helped change history. The exhibition went viral within days. News outlets picked up the story. Descendants of other children in the photograph came forward, sharing their family histories. Teachers wrote to Sarah, moved by Eleanor Preston's courage. One email particularly touched her. It came from a high school history teacher in Lowell. "I teach my students about the Industrial Revolution, about immigration, about labor movements. Now I can show them this photograph and tell them that one teacher, one act of documentation, one child's scarred hand helped change the world. Thank you for finding this story." Sarah printed the school photograph and hung it in her office. She looked at it every day, at Thomas Murphy's solemn face, his carefully positioned hand, the evidence preserved in plain sight for anyone willing to truly see it. That hand had told its story across 122 years, and now, finally, people were listening.